Good evening, everyone. A bit of housekeeping first. The fire alarm. If the fire alarm goes off, this will not be a trial run. This will be the real thing. So if you could all very calmly go out of this door and down through the exit you came in through, unless, of course, the fire is down there, in which case, if you could go out of the far door. Once you get out into Queen Square, if you turn right and go onto the little patch of grass outside the church where we will count you and make sure no one's left inside. Okay, our speaker this evening is Tony Coverdale. He is a chartered engineer and with a passion for history, particularly for the application of science to the Enlightenment. He is a retired naval officer and a STEM ambassador with the purpose of bringing engineering to a younger, newer, and wider audience. He has been involved with the Saltford Brass Mill Project since 2007, and he is here this evening to talk about brass production, Benin Bronzes, slavery, and much else. Tony.
Right, thank you. Good evening. So we're going to talk this evening about a period of about 300 years. In that 300 years, we're going to be looking at conditions in Africa and what they valued. We're going to be looking at the movement or the people from Europe looking to break into trade with West Africa. The Portuguese, the Dutch, eventually the British, first of all London and then Bristol. And from that spawned a brass industry, which by the late 1700s, hence the age of the Enlightenment, was probably the largest type of industry of this type in Europe. And we're going to see how that industry grew and blossomed, but then collapsed in the early 1800s and the reasons why. And of course, in the midst of all that is the movement of enslaved people. Now, in this, I'm going to tell the story factually about what happened. I'm not going to look into the morals about what was happening at the time. I'm afraid that's for you to think about in the midst of the story. And we'll look a bit at the end about some areas where I particularly had to think about that challenge. So going back to 2007, one of the things I found in the back of the cupboard, and you can probably see it, is a little thing here called a manila. And that was sort of hidden away. And I went along to look actually at a water wheel. Being an engineer, was interested in water power, but that intrigued me. And through that one artifact, I've then opened up a whole story. And it's interesting that that hadn't been looked at by other people who'd researched the industry. We'll look a little bit about that why at the end, but that's what's opened my eyes. So more about that to continue. So the brass mill. So if we go back to West Africa, Benin in the 18th century, 16th century, 15th century and before, this book by Eugenia Herbert, The Red Gold of Africa. And actually a contemporary description of a visit to West Africa in the early 1700s described of the Africans, this people of all metals love brass. They make great rings to wear about their wrists. And so taken are they with this base metal, that if a man lay down a piece of gold worth £2 before them, and a piece of brass worth 2 pence, they'd leave the gold and take the brass. They absolutely loved brass. And within that, brass is an intriguing material because it's an alloy of copper and zinc. You've got to get the copper and the zinc out of the ground. You have to, first of all, extract those and then alloy them to make this metal. And whereas in the Age of Enlightenment, we see a transition from alchemy to metallurgy, in Africa, it was seen almost as a religion, that it was the priests who follow a definite pattern to extract the copper and the other materials, and then to make brass. So they saw this almost as a religious thing, and hence had great value to it. And as I say, hence we can see they valued brass and copper far more than gold. And if we go on, that's the area we're going to be looking at. This is the Bight of Africa. Benin is just in here. And so that's the area that we're looking at. Now, it's interesting that that map was drawn around about 1700s, early 1700s. But this picture here is quite interesting of how the West saw West Africa. They see it as a relatively well-organized society. They have buildings. They don't have mud huts. They've got well-constructed buildings. And they are industrious. They are building things out of timber. So they don't see the West Africans as being ignorant savages. They see them as being a society as civilized as Europe. In fact, if this is a drawing from 1668 by Alfred Dapper, a Dutch traveller, and from his description of Benin, that was his image of the city. And you can see he draws it very much like a Western city with these, what he seemed to be church spires. But these are various buildings in there, and he sees the people of Benin here with their king, the Oba, and also we see these as Portuguese and Dutch merchant warriors. So that was their image of Benin. And as I say, they didn't see Benin as an ignorant country to be exploited. It was a civilized society, as civilized as Europe, that they wanted to trade with. And from that, and this is where Benin comes into it, is that if you go to the British Museum, this is a fantastic display of what's called the Benin Bronzes. Now, the first thing is they're not bronze, they're brass. The reason why these are important is because these were plates about the size of an A3 piece of paper, cast in brass using the lost wax method, and then were hung on the Oba or the King's Palace. So these adorned the outside of the palace. So they were high value objects. They obviously came into the possession of the British Museum through the looting of Benin in the late 1800s. That's a different story that we're looking at when they were made from the mid 1400s through to the 1700s and afterwards. And if we look at a particular one, this one dates to about 1450. And the important thing is that we see the Oba, the king. And behind him, we see two Portuguese warriors and merchants. And in their hands, you can see we have a sword and we have one of these things, a manila. And this actually features in Neil Ferguson's History of the World in 100 Objects. He sees this as an important transition because what we're seeing is the link between Europe and Africa and that trade. Unfortunately, that trade is in enslaved people, but that is more of the story. And this one, oops, comes back as he misuses the machine. This one is is a head which I think is still in the British City Museum, and it's actually cast again from brass. But the brass in both of these objects doesn't come from Africa. The brass comes from Europe, and that's part of this movement of materials. Now, the intriguing thing about these manillas is that they are, in effect, they are currency. We'll talk about their value in a minute, but that is currency. And one of the things is that Benin wasn't a particular center of the slave trade. In the 1400s, it was one of the major advanced civilizations. But what happened was that the Portuguese were able to produce these sorts of things much cheaper in Europe, and hence use them to trade with the West Africans. And in doing it, if you think of these as dollars and what the Americans have done to the world, I was in Egypt late last year. My wife was in India earlier last year. My daughter is working in the embassy in Baghdad. And in each of those places, one of the issues is, do you use dollars or do you use the currency, the local currency? And in particular, this is where the Europeans come in, because by flooding the market with brass, they destabilized the economy. And in fact, it was part of that Benin lost out to other smaller nations around. So that's the first thing, is that if you go in and trade with an area, you can destabilize the economy and change the economy. So there's a first lesson. But here we see the brass and the manillas. And here is another one of the another of those Benin Bronzes, this time with a Portuguese type merchant with these manillas around. And what we've got here, these are two other manillas from the collection of the Bristol Brass, of the Saltford Brass Mill Project. And I said these were in the back of the cupboard and almost forgotten. But the important thing is that they have on there the Harford and Bristol Brass Company, which emphasises that these were made in Keynsham or Bristol for selling into that West African trade. And in fact, on the back of these, those printed labels, there is handwritten that this is the currency of the Bonny district of Nigeria. This one is the currency of the Ivory and Gold Coast of Africa. And these are a man's arm ring and a woman's arm ring of West Africa. Now, it's interesting that those were probably made in Keynsham or Bristol. Those were probably made in West Africa and then brought back to Britain. And we'll talk more about that in a second. But that shows you that we've got this direct link between these forms of currency and West Africa. And this is where we're talking about. We saw the map earlier that there is the Gold Coast and there's Guinea. And we're talking about this route where we're taking goods, brass, iron, woolens, down into this area. And then the middle leg, the enslaved people being brought initially to South America, where the Spanish had their interests, but then for the Northern Europeans to the West Indies and North America. And then back from there, we get the tobacco, the cotton, the molasses, the sugar, the products coming back in to Europe. So that is and where we are, we're right at the start of that, putting these goods into that trade. So the Portuguese are the first to open this up, going in the 1450s. That later on, that is then that the Dutch break into that in the 1630s. And then what we see is the English breaking into that market after the Civil War, 1660. And so that is where our involvement starts to increase. Now, that is the middle leg. A fantastic picture there, which shows the number of enslaved people being brought from Africa into the Americas. And the size of those lines is indicative of the number of people who are being moved. And for Bath in particular, where direct links is this area, is the number of plantation owners buried in Bath Abbey are there. And Donald Trump and his ancestors are up here in North America, and of course the Spanish down here in South America. So that's the middle passage. Now, where's that brass coming from? So we're talking about the material going out to Africa, and that is a map of Western Europe around about 1700. And where the brass industry is centered is round about here, up on the Low Countries, what today is Belgium. But if we go back and look a bit closer, what we actually see is the Spanish Netherlands, Luxembourg, the Liège, and what is now Germany. And so this is the area of the brass industry in Europe. Aix-la-Chapelle, Liège, Namur, these are key centres of industry. And if we look at that on a modern map, this is we can see we're now in the heart of Belgium and just over into Germany. So that is where the Portuguese are getting their brass from. And that industry goes back to Roman times. That industry had carried on through that period. So there we can see where the material is coming from. Now, this is where London enters the market. So we've had the Civil War, we've had the unrest, we've then had the Restoration, and the king gets back onto the throne and 1660, we see London wanted to break into that market. The Dutch were in there. At this point, we're not particularly friends with the Dutch. We're fighting each other in the North Sea. And so there is a need to break into it. And what we see, 1660, the Royal Africa Company is established by Charles II to exploit the gold fields of the Gambia River. And as they go in there, there's a new charter, 1672, the Royal Africa Company of England. And they then set up forts and factories to maintain troops on that coast in West Africa to actually police that trade. So we're trading, but we're doing it with a heavy fist. And in fact, for those Latin scholars amongst you, the motto here, in fact, the other thing we're looking for is gold, silver, and slaves. But the motto is, by royal patronage, commerce flourishes, and by commerce, the realm. So this is a thing which is quite topical at present, because the monarchy is encouraging this trade. So there's the Royal Africa Company, and after Colston went for his swim in the river in Bristol, of course, about this time he's a shareholder in the Royal Africa Company. Now, this is where Bristol gets into the market. At that point, London have got a monopoly on trade, so they are keeping Bristol out of it. But this is where Bristol breaks in, and this is where we then get the Glorious Revolution, a break in now, 1688, that James II either goes on enforced leave to Europe, or he goes on holiday and doesn't come back. But whatever it is, he abdicates. He's absconded from the throne, and the parliamentarians bring in William and Mary onto the throne. Now, it's a bloodless revolution, but it's an important one for Britain, and it's an important one for the brass industry. If we go back in time, back to the times of Elizabeth I, what we see is that in 1565, Elizabeth had tried to break into this European brass industry. And she had formed the Company of Mineral and Battery Works in 1565, a royal initiative to try and stimulate British interests in that industry. And a couple of years later, the Society of Mines Royal put a royal monopoly on mining for particularly metals that would bring up bullion, gold and silver. But one place of getting silver is through brass for copper ore. So going after the copper, you would bring up traces of silver, and hence that got caught up with the Society of Mines Royal. Now, the 1688 and the Royal Africa Company comes in 1660, but in abdicating to bring in William and Mary, they actually severely restricted the role of the monarchy. Whereas James II, and before him, they'd actually ruled with a royal prerogative over everything. Actually, this said, no, we're now a constitutional monarchy. And their control was much reduced. And in doing that Bill of Rights, one of the things it did was actually abolish all these acts. And with all those acts being abolished, it then opened up the trade to Bristol. And so Bristol could then break into this market. And what we see out of that, those acts are then repealed and replaced with the Mines Royal Act and the Trade with Africa Act. But Bristol has got a way in. And so that's where we see the Bristol industry starting to form. And what we see in 1702 is the foundation of the Bristol Brass Company. Now, this is an intriguing one, that the investors in that company, the industrialists, were all Quakers. Now, this is the first interesting thing that I haven't fully got to the bottom of, that Quakers are happy to invest in an industry where it's going to go and purchase enslaved people. So there is an interesting moral question. But Quakers set up this company. Now, the thing, first of all, then if you look at a Bristol merchant, Thomas Phillips was a Bristol captain, and he did a voyage, as his book said, a voyage from England to Africa and forward to Barbados. So within that, and he described in great detail his passage and what he did. Now, in that, in trading for enslaved people, he recorded that cowries were essential, the smaller the more esteemed. By cowries, we're talking about cowrie shells. The thing about a cowrie shell is their uniform size, they're very hard wearing, they are the small change for trade. The other thing, he says, the next in demand are brass Neptunes or basins, very large, thin and flat. He says certain textiles were acceptable, but only to a limited extent. Near half the cargo value must be cowries and brass basins to set off the other goods. And this is an example of a type of pan. Now, we talked about our manillas. Once you've got the brass, what you can do is process that brass to make objects. And a Neptune is a basin similar to that. And the thing about the basin is that it has intrinsic value of the metal, but also to make a basin requires high quality metal. So the fact it's a battered basin and it hasn't cracked proves it's good quality metal. So it's a quality symbol. And also the basin, the bowl, has utility in its own right. So they are trade goods. And we're going to look at the size of those cargoes to go out to West Africa. Now, this is where we saw earlier. This is the center of the brass industry in Europe. And this is where Abraham Darby, those of you who've been up to Coalbrookdale and seen Abraham Darby, the founder of the Industrial Revolution, well, he was trained in Bristol as part of the brass company. He was actually what was called the active man of the brass company, a Quaker, and he was sent off to go and spy on what was going on here. And he not only learned what was happening and brought those ideas back, because we've got an industrial, a religious revolution going on. To the north here, we've got people who are Calvinists. Down here, we have the Spanish Netherlands, who are still Catholic. Now, any skilled men who were in the trade here, who were Calvinists, were being edged out of the guilds. And so hence they were losing their livelihoods. So not only was Darby able to learn the secret trades of the trade secrets, he actually encouraged those people to come over to Bristol. And we see families such as Ollis and Frankham and Vroy and Steger. And these are the families who were encouraged to leave this area and come over to the Avon Valley. And even as far as the 1920s, there were still clusters of these families around the key brass mill sites in Bristol. So here we see we're not only talking about the movement of enslaved people, we're moving about the movement of skilled people from the continental Europe into Bristol. So there is another movement that happened. What happened to Darby was that from the things he learned about how to work copper and brass, he realized he could apply the same to iron. And so then went on up to Ironbridge and then took those skills into iron. Also, at the same time, he was sending, in the early days, he was sending his iron back down to a man called Nehemiah Champion, who was running the brass company at this point, who was also a metal merchant, who was selling that iron to merchant venturers to trade in West Africa. So the whole lot is tied up with trade with West Africa. And this is where we see a record of 1704, written by the niece of one of his key workers. And she described how Abraham Darby went over to Holland and hired some Dutch workmen and set up a brass works at Baptist Mills. Baptist Mills is where the roundabout is at the end or start of the M32 in Bristol. Right underneath that roundabout is Baptist Mills. We'll touch on that in a minute, but this is where they set up that works. Now, as I said, that brass is an alloy of copper and zinc. So the copper came initially from this area, round about Truro down to Penzance. And these red dots are mines which are mining copper, which is going to come back to Bristol. And up around Tavistock, Morwellham, these red dots are mines. Now, we talked about Darby being a spy on the continent. We also get other industrial spies coming back the other way. So we have good spies. Darby is a good spy, spying for us. But we get people like Angerstein and others who are Germans and Swedes come to spy on us. And actually, a lot of our evidence comes from the diaries that they wrote. So a chap called Hendrik Kalmeter did a walking tour through the west of England. And he recorded that all these red dots were mines where the investment was Bristol merchants investing in the mines to bring out the copper. Now, what was actually happening was that these were tin mining areas. But as they were going deeper after the tin, they were finding copper ore, and it takes a lot of heat to get to extract the copper from its ore. And they were putting it on one side and called it podder because they have no fuel down here. But it was realised by the Derby and others that we could actually use coal from the Kingswood coalfield to smelt it. But it took 4 tons of coal to smelt a ton of copper. So it's more cost effective to bring your copper ore up to Bristol and smelt it up here than the other way around. And so the Bristol merchants were investing in these people to buy that podder up cheaply. And in fact, if you know your Poldark, that he's working down in this area. And there is one story where he suggests that they build a smelter and try and break the control of the smelters. But he's on a hiding to nothing because he's got no coal. And the Bristol merchants are the nasty guys who are trying to keep Ross under the thumb, and they win. And that's us. So we're the ones who are buying this podder up for the copper. And if we come a bit closer to home, back in the time of Queen Elizabeth, we had hired some German mining engineers to come and try and look for the other component, zinc, in the local area. And zinc was found, the Weston-super-Mare's down here, in Whirl, just on the edge of Weston-super-Mare. They came up with a material called calamine. Calamine is zinc carbonate, and that was the ore of zinc. In the early days, they didn't realise it was an ore of zinc. They thought it was, they called it calamine earth. But they did know if you heated copper in the presence of calamine earth, it turned into brass. And actually, one of the things, a different talk I do, looking at the technology, it was that understanding that zinc ore, that calamine was actually a zinc ore, was a great advance. But that's another story. But what they did find was, if you go up on the 36, is it, round Roborough and Shipham, this area, there are great reserves of calamine. So there we have got the copper and we've got the zinc, and that's brought down into this area, and this is the extent of the Bristol brass industry. There's Baptist Mills, we heard of, where Derby set up. This is the, if you go to the Locksbrook Inn at Twerton, that's the furthest east we get. So that is the range of the brass industry. And what we see is that there's Bath, there's Bristol, and you can see it in 1700. Bath is pretty much just in the confines of the walled area. We haven't quite got these buildings yet. Queen Square is in the future. And Bristol is about that size. And what we see is that, first of all, 1685, they started smelting lead using coal with a new invention called the reverberatory furnace. And there's one particular family called the Costers who are heavily involved in this. And that is just about underneath where the Clifton Suspension Bridge is now. And what they realized was that lead smelting technology could be used for smelting copper. So then moved over to here around about Conham, because here we're right on the edge of the Kingswood coalfield. So you can dig the coal out of the ground next to your foundry. So that's where they start smelting copper. Then we get in 1702, we get the Bristol Brass Company setting up in Baptist Mills. And then they expanded in 1710, they set up a second smelter at Crews Hole. So this is where we are actually smelting the copper. Then what they do is they take that back up to Baptist Mills. They then alloy it with the zinc that they've got from the Mendips and make brass. Now they cast some of it into Manillas. Others of it, though, they bring out to mills down here. And we can see Woodborough down on the River Chew, Weston Mill, which is just upstream of the Locksbrook Inn, Saltford Mill, Down Mill, and there's a second mill in Keynsham. These are what's called battery and rolling mills. Because what they're doing here is that mill sits on the River Froom, but these mills take the greater power out of the River Chew and the River Avon to then go into processing the metal. And then what we get in 1746 is a second company. We talked about Nehemiah Champion, who took over the fantastic names they had, wasn't it? Nehemiah Champion. Another chap on there is one Sifrel Tyndall. So fantastic names. But that 1746, Nehemiah's son, William Champion, sets up a rival company based on Warmley, because he's right in the heart of the coalfield there. And he also then expands with mills at Bitton and Kelston. He also sets up a second smelter at Kingswood up there. And so that is the sort of scale of the industry in the late 1700s. And in fact, there's another 1770s, there's another site again at Conham, which is looking at processing the zinc. So that is what the industry looked like at its peak around about 1770. Now, there's a great rivalry between these two companies. And as we'll see in a minute, that what happened was that one of them was going to lose out. And William Champion was the one who lost out. Actually, another little aside there. What happened here was that this company, its origins go back to 1702, which is before the South Seas bubble. With the South Seas bubble, the problem there was that with the promise of great returns, people invested in, and the investments went up, but the thing didn't deliver. And when it collapsed, we then lost financially, it was a disaster. So then there were laws brought in to prevent another bubble creating. Now, William Champion's company comes in after the South Seas bubble, and he is subject to great constraints on investment. And he's expanding dramatically, and he actually is more technically advanced than the Bristol company, but they can sell shares because they're an old company. He can't. And he overstretches himself, runs out of investment. He then does a heinous thing for a Quaker. He first of all absconds he tries to get his money out of the industry, and then he goes bankrupt. To a Quaker, going bankrupt is a cardinal sin because you've stolen money from your investors. So he makes a complete hash of it. But that company goes broke, and the Bristol company buys up his assets and then takes command of the whole company. So you can see the scale of that company. And if we look a little bit what's going on, first of all, look at this copper smelting and brass smelting. That Angerstein, another of our industrial spies, a Swede spying on us. And he describes, well, Calmeter, first of all, in 1725, describes at Cruise Hole 24 furnaces, producers capable of producing 200 tons of copper a year. Angerstein, coming 25 years later, 1754, talks about 49 copper smelting furnaces with a further 17, 66 in total, all by the great brass wire company. That's the Bristol Brass Company. So there we can see the scale of it. And what we're looking at is not that, but this little group of buildings there. Those are all these furnaces back to back at Cruise Hole. And that's what it must have been like, because bound up in the copper ore, there is arsenic. The ore itself is a compound of iron, copper, and sulfur. So coming off this is heat, is the products of coal, the smoke, there's the arsenic coming off, and then there's the sulfur. So it must have been pretty awful. But that is what's happening. The life expectancy of a smelter was his mid-30s. It was only when everybody else started living longer and they didn't that they realized there was something amiss. But that is probably the worst of the industry. But that's smelting the copper. But out of that, once you've separated your copper out, you're left with a slag, which is basically iron and silica. And it was mounting up as a slag heap, and the Bristol Corporation directed them to get rid of it. And the Quakers, a chap called William Reeve, who managed the copper works at this point, realized you could cast it into building blocks. And this is where we see evidence of the scale of that brass industry, because that is the Black Castle at Brislington. I thought when I first saw that 20 odd years ago, I thought it was a Walt Disney recreation. It goes back to 1755. It's actually a folly and stables and offices of William Reeve in the grounds of his garden. So all that black material is copper slag. And as you look around, once you've seen it, you'll see it everywhere. That's at Blaise Castle, where the Harford family, who later ran the company, lived. That's Kelston Park. You just go on the Upper Bristol Road. There's 3/4 of a mile of wall built by Capability Brown, and it's capped in copper slag. And that's the Contandando, the parish church there. So once you've seen copper slag, you'll see it everywhere. And that's a measure of just how widespread the industry was. So that's our brass melting. So we've got our brass, and that's what this is. We've got maps of what Baptist mills look like. This is the River Frome, and this is a chap called David Martin, who's is an architect works for Bristol Council, and he's produced a drawing of a reconstruction of what he think the brass industry mill looked like. And under each of these chimneys is a furnace for working the metal. And this is another industrial spy, this time a French industrial spy, Colonel Gallon, spying on the Spanish working in at Namur. And this is a description of what's called a cementation furnace, which is how you alloy the zinc with the copper. And so what we see here is a series of furnaces where the alloying goes on. We see the raw materials. Once the alloying is happening, oops, don't keep pressing the button. Go back. What we get here is that we see two gentlemen carrying a crucible full of molten brass, put it into a granite mold to create a thin sheet of brass. And so this is the whole process of making brass. And there is a whole of my technical talks about that process. We won't go more on that today. And that is going on up in this area. Now, if we now come back to these mills now, the processing mills, that what we're seeing there is mills such as Saltford Mill. Now, Saltford Mill was leased in 1721. It was a former grist mill, had been a fulling mill before that, and before that had been a flour mill. It's mentioned in the Domesday Book, but it was converted to a brass mill. And in doing that, what we can see is three chimneys, but within there, the water is coming in here. There is the dam and the leats are already in place. And what they're doing is taking that water power to drive a set of battery hammers. And those hammers, driven at high speed, actually enable you to take a slab of brass and then form it into those pans like we saw earlier. And but in doing that, it work hardens. And so what you have to do is periodically stop working it and put it into a furnace and heat it up to high temperature, about 600 degrees centigrade, and what's called anneal it. So each of those chimneys is an annealing furnace. And so there is a cutaway drawing of that annealing furnace. So that is what's going on inside the mill. And this is Gallon's drawing again, which shows the water-driven trips or tilts, the hammers, and in there we can see this man has just got a new piece of metal. He's just about to start. He's built a fully formed bowl, and he's going to make wire by drawing out a long strip. And these are typical of the skilled men that Derby has attracted back to Bristol. And this is a photograph not of Saltford, but of a mill on the continent, taken about 1705 in Stolberg, just over in Germany. And this is just before the mill closed, but this is typical of what those workers are doing. You can see the skills. They're making the pans by hand. These hammers are striking about 6 blows a second. It's a rapid motion. And to see a pan being made, it said it looked more like a potter working clay. It's not like a blacksmith working iron. It's a rapid movement, and you're drawing out these pans. And you say, if you think of how a potter would work clay, these men are working metal, thin sheets of metal, the same way. And you can see by hand, they're producing pans of pretty much uniform size. And that's what's going to go out to West Africa. So there's now the other thing we would say about that is that these things, this is where the Benin Bronzes come in, is that what they were doing in West Africa, they were taking this good quality metal and then melting it down and using that to make the Benin Bronzes. So that takes us full circle. We've got these thin shelled vessels, which are good quality, because if it was poor quality, that metal would have cracked. It's taken out and using the lost wax method, they're producing African art. And if you look down below in the display in the cabinet down here, there are 3 examples, well, 2 bits of brassware. There's one from the Ura tribe, another one from the Ashanti, which are things that have been made in West Africa using these sorts of materials. There's also a musket in there, which we'll see more about in a minute. So there we can see that full circle of where the skills to make these things are being used and what's happening to them in Africa. So the cargoes and the ships. This is where we get close now. This is where we heard about Thomas Phillips and his pans. So that's how this sort of pan was being made. And this is a plot, again, from the book I showed you right at the start, of the quantity of copper and brass going to Africa in the 1700s. And against that, what we can see is that this is where the Bristol Brass Company is formed. Now, this plot here is re-export. So that's where we've bought copper and brass from the continent and brought it back to Bristol to process. But you can see from there, and that's where the Saltford Mill comes in. And from this point, the brass company takes off. And you can see that we are then starting to, and that's where the Walmley Company is formed. And as these products grow and grow and grow, that's mirrored by the industry in Bristol. That's where Angerstein visited. That's where the Walmley Company goes bankrupt, and the Bristol Company takes over. But you can see we're still on the increase. And in the 1760s, Harford reorganized the company and take over the company, becomes the Harford and Bristol Brass Company. And if you remember those tallies on those manillas, that's what we saw. Harford and BBC, that's that company. So those must have been made at this sort of time. And we can see it peaks in the late 1790s. I'll talk about this in a minute. So that's on the up. Now this is an estimate of a cargo, and this is actually what it says on the estimate. It says it's an estimate of a cargo wherewith to purchase 250 Negroes at Benny. Benny probably means Bonnie. And down here, what we can see is a list of materials: chintz, long cloths. Then we can see muskets, and I talked about the musket that's in the cabinet below, which has actually got a stamp on it from the Royal Africa Company. So guns, gunpowder. But here we see 2 tons of lead, 500 weight of manillas with 22 inches at the bottom. So that's a pan, 22 inches in diameter, and they would cost to buy £40 in the currency of 1785, and 1,500 weight of manillas, which would cost £56, 5 shillings. Now, and then 1,000 copper rods. Now, on this, we've got various letters of instruction from merchant venturers to go and buy this cargo from local people, and to take that cargo out to Africa, and there to set up links with the slave traders in Africa, who are Africans, and to buy from them through negotiation. And here we estimate 250 people. So that's what that is all about. So it's a pretty horrendous piece of paper, really. But there we can now, 1,500 weight of manillas. I talked about my little example here, my exhibit. That weighs 75 grams. In 1,500 weight of those is 10,000 of those. These are small coinage. That in 1785 value is worth about a penny. So you can see the amount of money that we're going out for there. And so you're taking out £1,200. That means you're looking to spend about £5 a head on an enslaved person, and take them back to the Americas, and they sell them for between £20 and £25 a head. So that is the profit margin, and that's where the economics of it come in. And so here we talked about our manillas. That manilla number 1 is one about that size, the one in my hand. Manilla number 2 is a bit bigger. And these are ones which we think were made by melting down the metal that went out to Africa. And we think that our agents over there sent these back to Harford's to say, this is what's happening to your metal. Can you make something like this? Because we can sell them. That's a postulate. I haven't got a definite answer on that, but that's what we think is happening, because we know that is what they can make in Bristol. And now those manillas, these horseshoe-shaped armlets, typically made of copper, brass or bronze, they're commodity money. They've got intrinsic value for the metal that's within it. They can be traded as currency, and the pans can be traded for their utility. They say most notably the Guinea coast and the Gold Coast of Nigeria. And that was known as slave trade money after the Europeans started using it to acquire slaves. Now, that practice was stopped in 1807. That was the stopping of trading for slaves. Not the owning of slaves wasn't abolished till 1830. But 1807 is the abolition of slavery, and that's where the Bristol Brass Company took a big hit. Now, Samuel Timmins, writing of the industrial history of Birmingham in 1886, just looking back over the previous 100 years, says immense quantities of this species of money known as manillas once produced in Birmingham by casting. And it says that they were sending out to Bonnie. This is, as well as that produced in Birmingham, it was largely manufactured by the Bristol House of Harfords and the Cheadle Company. The Cheadle Company, whereas Harfords are going out of Bristol, the Cheadle Company are going out of Liverpool. So the same thing is happening in the north. And so that is what this is. And Samuel Timmins is looking back to say it's the work that they happened in Bristol and in Cheadle to understand this metal, that when the Industrial Revolution happened, we understood the metal. So that is, he's looking at it as a positive thing. But the intriguing thing is that this is going out to Africa. Now, this is the thing that was being made in the likes of Saltford Mill using those hammers. And this is known as a Guinea kettle. And that is known as a Lisbon pan. Guinea kettle because it's destined for Guinea in West Africa. A Lisbon pan because it was the style of thing that was being made in Lisbon in Portugal, because these can be stacked to get a bit large cargo into a ship. So that is what's being made in all those mills. This will be made in Twerton, in Saltford, in Keynsham. Madge Dresser, who's written a lot about the Bristol slave trade, records that James Rogers shows that Joseph Harford's, the Harford family, was still exporting brassware aboard Guinea ships as late as the 1790s. That's where our production line peaked. Now this is an extract from a letter of a group of merchants who were invested in a voyage. So this isn't the owners of the brass company. This is the merchant venturers who are investing in a voyage to go out to West Africa and the West Indies. And it's they're writing to Captain James Taggart. And he says, "We appoint you a commander of our Snow Swift." A snow is a type of ship. We'll come back to that in a minute. In order to embrace a fair wind, a good opportunity of sailing, with your complement being 30 in number in Bristol, and go straight to the River Bonny on the coast of Africa. And then once you get there and you get over the bar, endeavour to come to the knowledge of the best opportunity for trade and open up trade with the natives on the best terms you can barter for the whole of your cargo, as many as fine young men and healthy full-grown Negroes, men, boys and women, as will you will admit. And this cargo, we suggested you can get 280 to 300 people and buy them for about £5 a head. We hope you can sell them for £23 a head in the West Indies. Eventually they sold it in Antigua for £20 a head. And in that cargo, we can see we've got copper, brass and lead, 280 Neptunes, a ton of manillas, 375 copper rods, 820 lead bars, 600 muskets, gunpowder and flints. So this is the cargo that's going out in this ship, the Swift. And that is the Swift. She's about 90 tons. She's got 4 guns for self-protection, 28 crew on the outward voyage, 14 coming back. Owned by William Reeve, who we've seen already, who's managing the copper works at Cruise Hole. They got between 280 and 300 people on board. She went out in November of 1747, left 1748, got back June 1748. So just over a year. Now to put that to scale, go up onto the Kent Canal. That is a 70-foot canal barge. So you can see just how small these vessels were. They had to be small because they've got to come into Bristol down that passage. So tiny ships to get 300 people on board, being in charge of 28 coming back. You're just bringing cargo back. Hence, you can reduce your crew by half. And within that, there's also supporting trades. That we know that they needed compasses. And one of the products of we've seen from Saltford, is the compass bowl. Now, this one has been made into a pan, but actually the reason it's called a compass bowl, it's because it's this bit of the compass. Compass needs something non-magnetic around it, which is brass is ideal for. So they were making the wherewithal to make compasses. Also, the ships that were going out were being attacked by a thing called a Teredo navalis shipworm. That bit of timber is about 3 inches thick, and it's a shipworm, and it would bore through ships like this and would destroy a ship in a couple of seasons. And what they did was that in 1761, the Royal Navy, who was spending a lot of time in the West Indies protecting trade, that's the job of the Royal Navy, and they were suffering from this. And so they realized if they clad their ships in copper or brass, and that's actually the Cutty Sark, that's much later, that's 1869, but she's still sheathed in brass as an anti-foul. So the thing we get is that by sheathing our ships, and we know in 1768, the Hester is a Bristol ship which is sheathed in brass from the brass industry, that you can extend the life of the ship. And so there is another, and in Saltford Mill, in fact on that, we'll see some pictures. That's actually a copper bottom of a ship called the Trincomalee, which is now restored up in Hartlepool. There she is, and she is sheathed in copper. The Bristol ships would have used copper or brass. Brass is stiffer, so it's actually better than copper, and hence we see with the Cutty Sark in brass. And here again, Angerstein is talking about rolling materials. And so this is at Keynsham, an actual photograph from the 1920s. And we can see there's a water wheel driving this side, a water wheel that side, driving a set of rolls. And this has produced long, thin strips of brass, which is going to become wire. But at Saltford, they actually extended that to make a wide set of rolls. This set of rolls was 5'6" wide to make sheets of metal, which then could be taken out to sheathe the ships. So the industry is adapting to what the Bristol shipbuilders need and what the Bristol merchant venturers need. Now, where does this all come from? This is where we start to see the international scale of the industry. Now, there's a thing that you get traces of lead in the material, because we talked about the zinc coming up in the Mendip. Well, the Mendip is rich in lead, so there's traces of lead in there. Now, the thing about lead is it's got distinct isotopes. And if you can get the isotope of that lead, you can actually track it back to where it came from. And Oxford University have produced this database of knowing where the leads come from. So you can actually go back into the database and trace back the lead to its origins. Now, I've been working with a museum in Germany, and we've taken samples of all our manillas, and the results are quite interesting. There's our manillas we saw earlier, and we've taken samples of all 4 of those. And what we see is that these ones, which is the one that looks very similar to that one, the lead, not surprisingly, comes from the Mendip. So that's what we expected to see. This one, though, is quite fascinating because it comes up with, well, first of all, its style is similar to Portuguese type of manillas called a tacoas, as recovered from a Flemish cargo ship lost in 1524. But the lead in that does not come from Europe. It comes from a particular source which is only available in Australia, Cuba, or Chile. So it's quite probable that that source of ore is coming from the Americas. So it's coming back into Britain. And these ones, bear in mind, those were probably made in West Africa, that their lead comes from the Penites. So that material probably started life at the Cheadle Company going out through Liverpool. So you can see in those 4 samples, we've touched on 3 continents. And now we've talked about the copper coming up from Devon and Cornwall, but also we see in Cuba, there from 1544, there was a huge copper mine called the Cobra mine. And the Spanish used their slave labor out there to work the mine. It had been abandoned by the 19th century, but then it was then reopened. And in doing that, again, slaves and free coloured labourers were used, but then Cornish miners are going out to open up to that mine again. So that is probably where some of that ore has come from, back into that second Manila. And even in America, we've got records in the 1720s of 2 copper mines in New Jersey, just outside New York, shipping ore to Bristol. 1731, the Bristol Copper and Brass Works of Bristol, the chief purchasers of ore from the Schuler mine in New Jersey. This is coming back 1731. 1735, ore coming back to Bristol. 1754, skilled Welsh and Cornish miners going over to a place called Belleville, again near New Jersey, to mine. So you can see this movement of people across the Atlantic to get the ore out. There's New York, there's Belleville, and that's where these mines are. So that's where our ore's coming from. And there's a picture of the Belleville copper rolling mill. They're looking a bit later, 1813 to 1938. But you can see that is used for cladding various ships, which are the big American frigates. So there we can see how evidence of our work over in America. Now, decline and fall. Let's come into the end of our story. Now, we talked about this peak about 1790. What happens is there's the abolition of slavery in 1807, and with it, the industry collapses. That what happened there? That's what the industry looked like in 1770. We saw the extent of it. But then as we move forward, 1790, first of all, the two companies have been amalgamated. So the smaller mills, the outliers down here, are closed. The 1807 is the abolition of slavery. So therefore, the merchant ventures are no longer looking to buy great quantities of brass. 1809, we see the Warmley sites shut down, and they focus in on here. And also, there's better quality copper coming from South Wales. Then 1811, we see Western Mill, the outliers are closing down. 1814, we see Baptist mills closing down, and they focus then, Keynsham becomes the headquarters. 1825, we see Bitton on the River Boyd going, because it's a smaller mill, concentrating down into the centre. 1828, the copper smelting goes, and they just buy in their copper then from South Wales. 1838, we're now into the abolition of slave ownership, and that works that's zinc works goes at Conham. By 1749, Kelston Mill goes, and then 1870 we come down to just Keynsham and Saltford, and those two mills then remain operating. That can supply this Saltford supplying basically sheet metal and some pans. Keynsham focusing on wire, which has got other uses. And they carry on to 1925 when they go. And that is the end of the industry. Now, what happened was it wasn't the end of the brass industry, that Birmingham, we saw that record of Samuel Timmins, Birmingham picked up. And what actually happened was that we had the likes of Bolton and Watt. Bolton is the economics man. He was buying his copper and brass from down here. There was a peak in the price of copper, and the brass company tried to follow it with the price of brass. But Bolton said, hang on a sec, brass is copper and zinc, and the zinc is dirt cheap. The brass shouldn't follow the copper. And they said, well, take it or leave it. So Bolton says, I'll leave it, I'll make my own. And so the industry shifted from Bristol to Birmingham. And Birmingham then became the centre of the brass industry in the world through its industry. And Bristol, having focused on purely on trade with West Africa, didn't evolve. So that's why we see that industry collapsing. And the echoes of it we see are there's Saltford Mill, which is now a Grade 2 star listed building, the most complete of those mills. That is a bit at Warmley, part of a bit of the factory there at Warmley, again Grade 2 listed, I think. That is at Kelston. If you go down to Kelston Weir, which is just off the picture here, there we can see two annealing furnaces. And that housing is quite interesting because that was built by Champion, which is early industrial workers' housing. So he was caring for his workers, which is an interesting point to see. That is a bit of the Brass Mill pub at Keynsham. This building is Grade 2 listed. You can see bits of copper slag built into it. In 1825, that was known as the Old Mill. So that is part of that old mill on that site. There's the Black Castle at Brisbington we spoke about. And there are the capping stones of those various walls. There's the wall built by Capability Brown, using slag probably from Keynsham, from Walmley rather. And there's the Locksbrook Inn. We spoke about that on the just across the river, or across the canal actually, from from the brass works, and of course that is Brass Mill Lane. Brass Mill Lane comes up here, over that humpback bridge onto the island, which is where the brass mill was. And this is two programs, television programs, Civilizations and Remains of Slavery. This man is a man called Miles Chambers, who was the poet laureate of Bristol. He was the anchor man for a program called The Remains of Slavery. And we started in the mill where we were talking about guinea kettles and how you would trade them for people. I must admit, this had me a bit in trepidation, you know, old white bloke talking to a very large black man about slavery. We got on very well within that one. Also, Afua Hearst, who's quite an outspoken reporter. This bit didn't go on the television. It was going to be for an American series called Enslaved, but we didn't get off. We got lost on the cutting room floor. But again, with these people, I asked them, were we doing the right things to tell this story? And both said yes, that to not hide it, to tell the story exactly as it is. And they were both very, very content with what we were doing. And in fact, Miles wrote this poem which summed up that television program. He says, "What should we do with these West Country artifacts, shameful aspects of our history, pummel brass indentations on callous basins, barter for innocent souls, wrists weighed with currency made from unsympathetic bowls, arrogant Bristolians' ships heavy with the blood of African vitality, an eclectic tower boasting a view of sweet opulence as far as the eye can see, Beckford's Tower. Offensive submissive figures, why are you called a Moor? Bright white grave for a dark black boy made pure." That's out at near where the Hartford place at Blaise Castle. A medallion of abolition begging for liberty, which is the medallion cast by not Wilberforce, by the on the name's gone. Come back to me. Wedgwood. Thank you. And with an unusual viceroy given to a black master when he was just a boy. Show them, but don't celebrate them. To remind us what we did in the past, how we treated each other in pursuit of wealth. Least we forget, least history repeat itself. So that was, I think, is a fitting epitaph to the whole story. So at that point, I'm going to shut up and see if there's any questions.
Hang on.
That's it. We wait for the.
When was the Brass Mill built? When was it involved?
Right. So the Saltford Mill
No, the
was.
Bath one.
So the Bath one, oh, the Twerton one, that one was certainly, we've got a record of 1711, and it's in operation then. So it's actually converted from probably a fulling mill or possibly a grist mill between 1705 and 1711, and that then carried on operating through to the early 1800s.
Was there any coordination between the gunpowder Bristol company and Woolly?
On that, and Woolly, no, in that, that's another leg of the goods. The coordination is actually back to the investors in the cargo. That the people who invest are saying this is where to get your materials from. So that's where they would have been directed to get your gunpowder from the likes of Woolly, and to get your brass from the Hartford Company. So that link comes from the letters of the investing merchants to the masters of the ship.
Thanks.
You have a question?
Thank you for this wonderful lecture. I wanted to ask you, first of all, what were the number of people who were involved in producing all these minerals at the height of the trade and production? Because you've shown us all the different locations, but were they very small numbers of people in them?
Right. So
and
within
the
that,
second question is, what did the merchant venturers invest in after the collapse of the slave trade?
Right. So in that, so first question, unfortunately, the actual numbers we've been, as the industry collapsed, a lot of those records were destroyed. So what we've got to go on are the records from those diaries so that they're only estimates. Within that, we do know we've got a photograph of the workers, which is a combination of Keynsham and Saltford, taken later in 1870-ish, and there's 70 people in that picture. So there's 70 people in the two mills. So now, and you can see there we have 13 sites, so you can scale up from there. I've looked at Saltford Mill. In about 1740, there were 12 hammers, and we know they were working shifts, and there's 4 furnaces. So if you say you've got, just on a shift, you've got 12 skilled men, and there's probably at least 1 labourer to every skilled man moving stuff around, and you've got a different set of skilled men operating the furnaces, and they're working shifts. So I estimate there was probably 40, say, at Saltford, and there were 13 sites. So that you scale that up, that's the sort of numbers we're looking at. And certainly in terms of the movement of people, we see the names of about, I think it's about 8 families coming over initially in about 1705, but they're complete families with increased numbers of workers. So they are significant numbers. And so, yep. The second question: where did they invest afterwards? Being merchant venturers, it's like merchant venturers today. That they will invest where they see a profit. There is still trade going out to Africa, but not for slaves. There is still and in fact this one is an intriguing one, because this comes from the wreck of the Douro, which went down in 1835, I think it was. So it's gone down after the slave trade is abolished. So the question is, were they going out with that to trade for ivory, gold, and other materials legitimately, or was that an illegal cargo to go out to America? We don't know. But they are traded. By this point, Bristol is a well-established port. And in fact, the links are then set up with North America. We've seen those materials coming back from North America into Bristol. And Bristol becomes, along with Liverpool, a dominant port for trading with America. And so we are taking goods out as America is evolving. This is why our fortunes went up and down with independence and civil wars and the like. But America is a key trading partner. And also we're seeing things like timber coming down from Scandinavia. So it's they lose one market, but other markets are available.
Can you?
Two questions. One was you mentioned wire, so I'm interested in what the purpose or what use the wire was put to.
Yep.
And the second question was you talked about the crew of the ship halving. So what happened to the people who got left behind?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Two good questions. So the wire, if we go back to Queen Elizabeth, one of the things that we were after wire for was the woolen industry. That if you're going to wool, you need to card the wool. And the carding combs, if you think, I'd say carding comb without me showing how you do it, that you had a card with pins on it. Now, steel was good for those pins because it was stiff, but it rusted and would damage the wool. Brass was stiffer, was not as stiff, but it didn't rust. So brass wire was in demand for making carding combs. And that's why Queen Elizabeth wanted it. Then also brass rod was going out to Africa, and you see pictures of rods around necks to try and look to extend the neckline. So it was part of a cargo going out to Africa. But then once we got into the later period, then as the Industrial Revolution is going, there is a demand for a multitude of uses of wire. And that's why Keynsham Mill carried on making wire. And in fact, it's making it in a very, the processes carried on through to 1925, which was still reminiscent of what had been happening in 1725. They didn't really modernize, whereas elsewhere, more modern methods of wire production. But even by 1725, it was still a very vibrant wire making process, but with a multitude of uses. And in fact, at various talks like this, I've had people say, yes, my family made bird cages in Bristol, and they used to buy their thin rod from Harfords. Also, the thicker rod that ladies' dresses, the camisole, the framework for those. I've also had a contact with a professor in Canada who was researching harpsichord strings. And we had a long discussion there about the wire that was needed for making harpsichord strings. So once you've got that myriad of uses. Now, the other one about what happened to the other 14 sailors. Interestingly, a key thing of merchant seamen is you sign on for a passage, and then you get signed off. And you don't necessarily get signed off where you started from. So they would have been signed off in the Caribbean, those that survived. Certainly the west coast of Africa was not a healthy place. Things like yellow fever, it was the white man's grave. So there is natural wastage of your crew getting out there. But also you would have signed them off in Antigua, that one. And then you would have signed on the 14 who weren't troublemakers to come back with the cargo. So, and then that's the lot of a merchant seaman. He's then in Antigua, another ship that's come up and has lost people to sign on again. So it's, yeah, the loss of a merchant seaman. If you've watched or read things like Lord Jim, in fact, all the Joseph Conrad really bring that to light about that, the loss of a merchant seaman. So not exactly a secure occupation.
Yeah, a question about the Benin Bronzes being all brass.
Yep.
Were they all brass from the start, or did they start off as bronze and then become used brass when it became available?
No, mostly brass. Going back to the book I spoke about earlier, the materials, the raw materials they started with in Africa, they didn't particularly have the tin. There is some bronze around, but they were focused on copper and brass. And so that was the materials that they saw and understood. And it was the Portuguese and then others who capitalized upon that and sold back to them the materials they wanted. And in fact, one of the things you see there is that the process we had of called cementation, that produces a natural equilibrium of 28% zinc in your brass. The chemistry is quite complex, but it does. And that gives you this malleable material, which you can then shape into pans. If you don't get rid of all things like arsenic or lead, when you try and hammer it, it will break, it will crack. And Angerstein noted that one company, they were making the rods to turn into wire by hammering. And he says, why don't you extrude it? And he says, because the client wants to see hammer marks in the rod to know its quality. So therefore, we're making it by hammering. So yes, they knew it was brass, and that's what they were after. So the merchant venturers were selling them what they wanted. So it's market driven.
Thank you for a fascinating and impressive set of research that you've done. Two questions also. One is, could you say more about the destabilization of the West African economy that you mentioned at the beginning by the sort of influx of brass items? And relatedly, what you know about the structure of the Benin economy in terms of the wealth, if they're able to siphon it off into art and status goods, then there's obviously a certain degree of differential between different parts of the economy. Yep. In terms of their ability to do that. And the second question is around the decline of the industry and why it wasn't able to survive by
diversifying.
Yeah, by taking its products in, I guess Wedgwood was coming up with China, so domestic, maybe, but you'd think there'd be more of competition between China and porcelain and copper domestic goods. So I'm just curious about why they couldn't repurpose themselves.
So taking that second question first, that certainly Wedgwood is another Quaker. and the families are all interconnected. That's why the strength of those families. By the time we get to the early 1800s, their Quaker discipline is starting to weaken. I think they're becoming Anglicans. And actually, interesting where the families have one family is Lloyd's. One Samuel Lloyd is a key investor in Walmley, and he goes on to form Lloyd's Bank. And Harford's goes on to found the Harford and Miles Bank, which through various mergers is now part of NatWest. So the key people start moving away from industry and more into the financial market. And similarly, we get Matthew Bolton is probably a key person, because he is of Bolton and Watt. Watt is the engineer, Bolton is the businessman. And there, whereas he sees the way to diversify, there wasn't a Bolton down here at that point to take that on. So I think that's the answers to where the diversification comes is key people. I think Matthew Bolton is a key character in that, because he shifts the industry to Birmingham. And it's the fact that these people are moving, because the reason why the Quakers could do this is that they trusted each other in family links. So when you can see there's a lot of capital expenditure in this to build this up. So they are investing in the companies, and that's where they can get the capital to build these mills. And that's why when William Champion goes bankrupt, it is a major sin that you've stolen that money for your investors. That ethos has sort of gone by the early 1800s, and we're seeing that the banker genes coming to the fore. So I think that's where that one goes. The other one, certainly in the 1400s, if you go to the British Museum, read all about the Benin. There you can see that Benin City is a centre of excellence in West Africa, and they've got control over neighbouring areas. They are the kingpin, and within that, the amount of brass that's coming locally, it's certainly been used to clad the Ober's palace, so it has got great value. And the artists who are making that, because the lost wax method is you have to make your wax mold, put that into a clay, fire it, the clay hardens, the wax melts, you pour that off, then you melt your brass and pour it into the mold, and then break the mold off. So you can see it's quite a complex process, and so that's not cheap. And so the fact that we see the Ober, the king's palace, clad in this shows there is a hierarchy. Now, and they've got, because of that money, they've got military control over the area. What we then get, though, is the Portuguese and the Dutch and ourselves coming in, and we're bringing guns and cheap money. So we're flooding the market. And hence, because of that, it destabilizes it. And so Benin loses its status, and Africa becomes a more stable place. And of course, hence we're building our forts on the coast to try and control the trade. So it's quite a complex interaction. And I think in that there's probably a couple of PhDs to fully answer your question. And there was a third bit, wasn't there? What was the other bit you asked?
I just wonder if I just wondered if the iron industry, the rise of the iron industry, had anything to do with the brass industry, you know.
Right, yes, I mean, and the answer is yes, because what happened was that in what Derby was looking at was that this is made by taking a basic template and then casting it in sand. Mm. And what he realised was that same casting could be done with iron.
Yeah.
Also, what he realised was that he was starting to understand the use of coal and sulphur. An awful lot of this is trying, because the coal here has got a lot of sulphur in it, and to work the metal, you've got to try and get rid of that sulphur. So he's starting to understand the chemistry of furnaces, and that's where he saw that you could then take those ideas over into iron, and then he moved forward up to Ironbridge. As much as anything, because there's or Coalbrookdale really, Ironbridge is the later name, Coalbrookdale, because there's lower sulphur coal up there. and he buys up an existing furnace, but then adapts it to making the iron. But in the early days, I think a lot of his product was then being sold back to Nehemiah Champion, who, as well as being head of the brass company, was also a metal dealer who was taking that back in, and that was then going out to Africa as well. You can see in those cargoes we've got iron. So it mirrors it. We've got the same people, in fact, and the technology is moving across, which is back to what we were saying earlier about the application in the age of enlightenment.
Yeah. Oh, who was it? Somebody here? No? No. Oh, you did.
Sorry, just the Angus Stein with the diary.
Yes.
See the same Angus Stein who made it in London, and in Greenwich there's an Angus Stein hotel.
Good question. Is he there? I mean, his diary is quite fantastic. It's all been translated into English. So it's a massive tome. I'd have to double check that. I know Greenwich quite well. I lived out there for a long time, so I need to go back and check that. But it could well be. Certainly, his it's quite a distinctive name. But yes, there's so many entries in there. I need to go back and read the whole thing again. So I'll take notice of that question. Unless I get one question I don't know the answer, it's pointless talking. So I can then go and find something else to go and research. So I shall find out.
There's a question
All
online.
right, yes.
Fantastic talk. Thank you. I have enjoyed it very much. Did the brass mills make anything for domestic consumption?
Right. So on that, they're making these pans called Guinea kettles and Lisbon pans, and they were clearly making them for domestic use as well. And we do have records that at Norton St. Philip, just down the road at a market, workers were taking those pans down to Norton St. Philip and selling them at market. And a lot of the examples that in the brass mills collection were made by workers for their own use.
Oh,
So they're making, for instance, we talked about those Neptunes. We've got a description of a Neptune, but I've never seen one because there isn't a use for it in Britain. And so there aren't any. I've also looked around many National Trust properties, and you don't see brass pans. What you see are lots of copper pans later on from the Victorian period. So yes, they were being made for domestic use, but it tended to be quite local. And it was a spin-off from what was being made elsewhere.
Yes.
The other thing that we did, they were particularly useful, which is why Saltford carried on, was that they made what's called milk pans, and that most farms had an outbuilding with a heater in it, and they would be using the pans to make curds and whey and cheese.
Oh,
And we've had several visitors to the mill who've said, yes, I remember my grandmother had a pan like that, and that's where she made cheese. And in fact, she had two, she said, that on Monday morning, she'd take the shallow one out and put a deep one in and do the washing. So yes, they did have some uses for domestic use.
Any more questions from the audience here? Oh.
You mentioned Cheadle being another source centre. There were more ships coming out of Liverpool as the century progressed in the 18th century. From about, I think, 1725 onwards, they dominated the trade, and then also Glasgow. Was there a greater brass production in Cheadle than places north rather than in Bristol, or did Bristol dominate the brass trade?
No, as it went on, two things happened. One is that Liverpool was on the up, and as you say, the number of ships going out of Liverpool, mainly because it's a much easier port to get in and out of, and they build a floating harbour before Bristol, so they developed the port more. Also, there is upon the North Wales, the Great Orme. There was and in fact up onto Anglesey, there was a huge open source copper mine, and that mine then came to dominate, and so the source of copper in the north was much easier to get at than it was in Devon and Cornwall and elsewhere. So because of the supply of copper up in North Wales, the northern market that we mentioned, Cheadle, Macclesfield, up on the north coast of North Wales, there was a mirror industry, but I think towards the end of the 1700s, they start to dominate, or they're bigger than Bristol, and we certainly see rivalry between the two companies. And in fact, when William Champion went bankrupt, he did go up and work for the northern companies. So there is definitely two outlets, and Liverpool by the end of the century is on the up.